Hello everybody, this is S Monty Gaming again. Today we're going to be looking at CK3's combat mechanics. In our last video we had explored stacking prestige modifiers, and whilst messing with the cool knight perks from the Gallant Tree, I couldn't help but notice how devastating my champions had become. So in this video, in addition to covering the battle mechanics and army composition, we'll take a look at how to build some powerful knights and why stacking effectiveness bonuses are so strong. Combat in CK3 isn't awfully transparent, but we'll cover the main structure as this should provide the most insight as to what's going on when your troops clash. When your army meets a hostile army in a barony, a battle ensues. The defender in a battle is determined as whoever arrives first in the territory. So if you've just stood in place, you would naturally be defending and thus receive any terrain bonuses. The exception to this is when an army is besieging and engaged by an enemy. In this case, the besiegers are not considered defenders despite their initial presence in a barony, and consequently would not receive any defensive bonuses. Since there are many factors that go into a battle's outcome, the best way to gauge a potential battle's success chance is by viewing the icon that pops up in the territory where your armies will potentially battle. This indicator will summarize each army's set of advantages and disadvantages to give you a rough estimate on which army will be the victor. Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty. You're in a battle, so what's actually happening? Well, each battle is broken down into 4 phases, and before we jump into that, we must quickly define casualties, as the distinction between routed and fatal casualties will be referenced a few times in our discussions. When armies are squaring off, their respective sizes are shown next to one another. As the phases progress, these numbers will decline, reflecting unit casualties. Some of these unit casualties will be routed casualties, and thus, those troops will remain after the battle finishes. There will also be a number of fatal casualties, in which units are killed and, as you guessed it, will not return to combat. Each battle starts with the maneuver phase. This is your setup. The army gets to the battlefield and your commander gives their initial advantage roll. As you'll see, no casualties are inflicted during this phase. Next is the early battle phase. This is where the combat starts. If you watch the battle screen closely, you'll notice that both sides will take a similar amount of casualties when the opposing forces are close in size. I suspect an army with more ranged units will have more success during this phase, but this is purely conjecture based on the representing icon being a bow, and I haven't done any specific testing. Note that if one side wins during the early battle phase, the routed casualties become fatal casualties, and thus leaving only a handful of units limping home for reinforcements. Once the early battle phase completes, the late battle phase will start, and this is where the bloodbath begins, as the game applies one side's damage value against the other side's toughness value. During this phase, you'll see the most casualties, and thus, this is where your knights and men-at-arms will shine, since they make up for a large proportion of your overall damage. More on this in a second. Once one side has been completely routed and a victor determined, the aftermath phase begins. During this phase, the winning side gives chase and attempts to make any casualties fatal. Units such as cavalry with high pursuit values will inflict more damage during this phase, whilst units with high screen value attempt to mitigate this on retreat. Once this phase completes, the retreating army then runs towards their home territory at a pace slightly faster than a controlled army, so consider this before chasing. Now yes, the mechanics are a mouthful, but they basically boil down to just this. Your troops' damage must exceed the defending army's toughness. There is some randomness from the commander rolls and terrain/battle modifiers to consider, but this is the general idea. This is why your army's composition is so important, and thus the game will represent your troops' quality next to their size. It seems that the higher the damage to troop ratio is, the better your army's composition and quality. Now, this ratio does not care about your troop size, so if you have an elite squad of 2 soldiers, yes, they'll look nice, but they're not going to accomplish anything meaningful on their own. Your army may be comprised of levies, a commander, men-at-arms, and/or knights. Levies are your most basic form of troop and are essentially your realm's unskilled townsfolk being forced to fight. This is reflected by their 10 damage and 10 toughness, so all things constant, when equal-sized levies are fighting, either side should win at least 50% of the time. Your army should have a commander. A commander uses their martial skill to improve their army's outcome with an advantage roll. The commander may have one of many commander traits that may alter this roll for better or for worse. In our example of an evenly matched levy battle, a good advantage roll will naturally equate to a win for that side. Men-at-arms can potentially make up the bulk of your army strength, as these units generally have more damage and toughness than your levy. Now it gets a little complicated when fighting other men-at-arms troops, as there are specific unit counters, so if you're attacking a ruler that has, let's say, bowmen, you might want to consider adding a regiment of cavalry, as this is a direct counter to the bowmen. Finally, we have your knights, singularly the most powerful troop in your army, as for each point of prowess, they get 100 damage and 10 toughness. So effectively, a 1 prowess knight can inflict the same damage as 10 of your levy. Check out this big boy I ended up with. That's 3,000 damage, and that's even before we talk about the effectiveness modifiers. Note that patch 1.1 changed it so that your knights do not increase your troops' quality indicator. It may have been overstating their strength before, so just remember this when you're looking at the battle success chance indicator, and it mentions the opposing forces having a better troop quality, as this may not be the complete story. Now that we've laid out how combat works for the most part, we can see why knight effectiveness modifiers had such a large impact on my playthrough. I may have missed it in game, but I could not see anywhere that represented a knight's stats after the modifiers were applied. Though from the total effectiveness modifier stated at the top of the knight's detail page, we can calculate how damaging my 30 prowess knight is. When we take his 100 damage and multiply it by the 255% modifier, and then subsequently multiply it by his 30 prowess, we end up with 7,650 damage. That's almost 800 levy worth of damage from just one unit. When you stack your army with other knights like this, you'll definitely notice how devastating their damage can be during the late combat phase, as you'll see the opposing army's casualties pile up in literal chunks. Just don't get too cocky, you don't want them to end up dead or imprisoned. So if you're interested in building super effective knights, there are a few different sources to acquire modifiers from. Gallant Tree is the most notable one, as you'll get chivalric dominance, which gives 75% effectiveness. And also, if you go down this route, you can pick up knighthood relatively easily and get 4 more big boys to your rank. Not to mention the chivalry focus will also give your knights additional advantage and prowess. You can pick up another 20% effectiveness from innovations if your culture unlocks knighthood from the high medieval era. If you've accumulated enough renown, you can elect the Dynasty Legacy Warfare, as level 1 will give you a quick 15% knight effectiveness. When it comes to constructions and historical buildings in baronies, the list can go on and on. Tribal rulers, though, have it pretty easy, as the training camps are very accessible right out the gate. In my test game, I went tribal and was able to build 3 warrior lodges and 2 sparring grounds in my direct holdings, which equated to 80% effectiveness from buildings alone. On top of that, you'll add 75 for chivalric dominance, and that's what accounted for my 255 effectiveness. Check out this battle where I send my troops at a defending army in a taiga. Outnumbered and disadvantaged, yet still successful. It's worth noting I was light on men-at-arms here, as I wanted to focus on knights, and in an attempt to measure their impact, I tried to match my opponent's bowmen. Shortly after, I had a bit of fun with the AI throwing leagues of troops at me. You can watch as I slay them one by one. It was way too much fun. This is why I'm thinking of following this video up with a Let's Play featuring this build, as it'll definitely be an entertaining way to play and to watch. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can catch those when they're ready, and of course if you want to see more mechanic guides and builds. I also really hope this guide was helpful, as for me, combat just felt so mysterious. Definitely looking forward to see you all in the next one. Take care.